Hello everyone, I'm Casper. I'm the founder of Testimony, where we help our clients make sure that they deliver their software fully cooked instead of half-baked. And here on YouTube, we help the aspiring QA engineers become test automation engineers one slice at a time. And this time, we are going to tackle a pretty important topic. So in the beginners, I see the proclivity to feel learning to code. And this manifests in various scenarios. So first of all, people tend to overcomplicate the case of which language do I learn? How do I start? So we have a video on the channel already about this specific topic where we discuss how you should choose the right language to start your learning from. And we also discuss why it doesn't really matter. So sorry for the spoilers. But I really recommend watching that video beforehand. Unless you've already made your pick, then I of course welcome you to start from this one. And so after people choose the language, they usually tend to get stuck on the next step, which is how much of programming do I really need to know? And this stops people right in their tracks because, again, people tend to get stuck in this analysis paralysis where they don't really know how much knowledge do they actually need. They know that the language doesn't really matter. They know that the general knowledge of programming is what is important, but they still don't really know how to translate that into practical knowledge of which topics do I actually need to learn. And to tackle this, we are going to have a little discussion about it in this here video. So let's jump to our whiteboard where we are going to discuss how much programming knowledge do you really need to get into test automation. So the title of this video is of course a little provocative because of course there's no real harm in being a good coder when it comes to being a good test automation engineer, but we are going to talk about the exact knowledge you need to have if you want to get into the field, but you want to have that in an attainable time frame, and you want to know what actually is needed for this endeavor. And the answer may surprise you because, frankly, first of all, and hot take alert, you don't need to be a good programmer in order to be a good test automation engineer. And this may be a little shocking for some people. But also, I would say that you don't even need to be a good programmer to get into development, but that's for another day. But you don't need to be a good programmer to be a good test automation engineer, because test automation is just so much more. It's an interdisciplinary field, and you need to marry knowledge from different fields and be pretty decent at most of them, if not all, and great at testing if you want to be a good test automation engineer. It's very similar to if you were competing in a decathlon, let's say. Of course, you wouldn't be exceptional at all sports that are contained within. It may very well be that you have won an event, but your running in like one of the sports was pretty wonky. And still, what matters is that in total, you manage to get enough points. And you should think about test automation in the same way. It marries a lot of technical knowledge together. And yes, you need to be decent at programming. And of course, if you want to be a great test automation engineer, you need to be a good programmer. And I would say that it is never harmful to know more than less. But still, in order to get into the field, the amount of knowledge you need to gather for that, the amount of programming knowledge you need for that, is actually way less than you probably think. And it is way less than you have probably learned over like your endeavors and trying to learn from different sources, because I think that people greatly overestimate the amount of programming knowledge you need in order to get into the field of test automation. And so let's dissect this a bit. And before we do, let's once again reiterate that you don't need to be what people consider a good programmer or a good coder to get into test automation. And once again, remember, there's no harm in being a good programmer, and we'll talk about how to actually become one over your experience, but you shouldn't focus on that when you are just getting into the field. And I hope this also takes off some psychological baggage from your head when you think about that, because it is actually freeing if you know that you should know the fundamentals, but you don't need to be a jack of all trades in order to be a good test automation engineer or to get into the field. So, of course, disclaimer for this video also, I am going to be talking about stuff at a more high level because I want to keep this language agnostic. So whichever language you chose, whichever testing framework you are planning to learn, you can just carry on, because even if I do some examples, they carry over to different domains just as well. So they do carry over to other languages and other technologies and stuff like that. So I feel like most of the resources you tend to find online tend to focus on making you a programmer the same way regardless of your plans in the future. Like, they try and teach you in the same way regardless of your plans. And I think this actually hinders your performance. I think it slows you down, and I think it's not a good way to go about it. And that's why we're going to demystify a bit here. Because once again, your goal is not to become a 10x developer, it's to become decent enough that you can actually get into automation itself. And this is the first big point that I would like to underline, is that programming is a tool, not a goal. And what I mean by that is that your goal is to be able to jump into learning the tools of the trade, which are the test automation frameworks, as soon as possible, basically. And if you don't have programming knowledge, you need to gather enough of it first so that it does not block your learning. It does not slow you down. It does not make you constantly jump like to the documentation or to a programming tutorial. And it does not make you fight a battle both like in the front and in the back at the same time, because learning both of these things at the same time is like that. Many people ask, shouldn't I just go straight to the test automation framework and then try and learn programming along the way? And why, of course, it is possible. I wouldn't say that it is, you aren't really committing any special sin if you are doing that. But I don't think it's the way to go, because it slows you down. It creates more headaches than it's worth, to be honest. Because as we are going to explore in the next few minutes, actually, the amount of programming knowledge that is needed to comfortably start learning a test automation tool is low enough and takes short enough of a time that I don't really see a point in trying to kind of jump around that and go straight to test automation, because you can gather the knowledge that we're going to cover in a second pretty quickly. And by pretty quickly, I can't really give you even a ballpark figure, because we all learn at a different pace, and depending on your also professional standing and your free time and stuff like that, you may have more or less time to learn, more or less energy and stuff like that. But I would say a time frame of 2-3 months, generally speaking, which may of course be 1 month for one person and 4 months for another one, but I would say like a ballpark figure is something like 2-3 months. So if you invest that time, you'll learn the basic premises of programming, which set you basically for life. And I can't stress this enough. I am not really trying to promise you some imaginary rewards here. It really is the case. It's like riding a bicycle. Once you get the overarching concepts of programming, and I talk about that in length in this video that I talked about in the beginning of this one, which is also on our channel, called "Which Programming Language Should You Learn to Become a Test Automation Engineer?" But in short, the knowledge you get from that is actually going to carry over to all other languages you learn throughout your life, and it will also carry over to all other tools that operate based on those languages, like the test automation tools. So I don't really see the reason for not doing that first, because really you are not gaining as much as you think you are if you are jumping straight to test automation, because what you make up, you are going to lose when you then need to have two battles simultaneously. So having said that, like I said in the beginning, if you really can't wait to just jump and learn some framework or Cypress or Playwright or the next shiny toy that comes our way, feel free to do that. Of course you can, but I think you aren't really doing yourself a favor through that. I would say you will get more overwhelmed that way. And if you fancy programming, there's no real reason to stop learning after you are ready to get into test automation. Then you can just branch out and you can learn test automation simultaneously with learning more programming. You can learn more throughout your career, and you will learn more, because what I'm about to present is just the bare bone fundamentals that you need to be able to apply for some test automation jobs after you master some test automation tool also, of course. But it's not like you stop there and you just never touch programming again. You very much can just continue learning. You can carry on with learning programming while also learning the tool. And believe me, having those two battles, having learned the fundamentals and then learning more advanced programming and tools of test automation at the same time, is going to be way easier than not learning anything in the beginning and just starting with test automation and the programming fundamentals at the same time. It'll be way easier and way more performant to do it the first way that I mentioned than trying to go from zero to kind of understanding that at the same time, both for the automation tool and for programming language. So don't get discouraged. I'm not prohibiting you from actually learning to program. I very much encourage this, and I think another video will be also dedicated to that, because I think there's great utility in learning more programming in order to become a better test automation engineer. But I think it should not be your goal if you are just trying to get into the field, because you don't want to get stuck in the tutorial hell forever. So you should learn only as much as is needed and not try to over-encumber yourself with too much knowledge at the same time. So having said all of that, let's jump into the actual programming concepts that I think are important in order to be able and be ready for learning test automation. So let's call it essential knowledge. And so the first thing are fundamentals, which are things like variables, data types, operators, expressions, collections. So these are the fundamentals. By that I mean the very bare bone minimum that you need in order to progress in any programming languages. So you need to know what variables are. What is a variable? How do I define one? How do I address one? How do I know how to assign something to it and how to use it? How do I know how it's even represented? This also is tied with data types. You need to know at least your primitive data types, like integers, strings. Whether string is a primitive data type is also up for discussion depending on the technology, but maybe I would say the essential data types to be more precise rather than primitives. So like integers, characters, strings, stuff like that. You need to know what data types there are. You need to know how to use them, what are the limitations. You don't need to know too much. So like knowing that there's going to be an exception thrown by the language if you try to squeeze a number into a string is going to be enough. You don't need to know the exact ranges of integer and of a double type and stuff like that. You don't need that. So just the most important stuff, what kind of data types there are, how do I know which data type my variable is, how do I cast this variable into another data type. Same goes for operators, expressions. You need to know what is an operator. Sometimes also the order of operations. What is an expression, a statement? It may seem like law, but what I'm discussing here is going to squeeze into like a 2-hour learning session, and you're going to feel comfortable with all of this. So, and also the collections, because you need the collections to actually be able to gather your variables into some kind of a bucket. So collections are nothing more than just, like the name suggests, collections of other variables or values. So you need to know that, because you need to be able to somehow have a lot of variables squeezed into a common container. that is represented the group representative of the group as a whole. And of course, it can't really be discussed whether you need this for test automation, because you need it for anything regarding programming. And of course, a lot of things are going to be represented in test automation through that, like variables. You are going to need that both for some settings. You are going to need that for keeping the locators. You're going to need that in your resource files to keep some values. Same goes for like the collections. You are going to need to somehow keep the groups of variables together, like for example, all the locators for some elements or on a page or in a form or stuff like that. So it is really important, and it is the thing that you should start with. After you are done with that, I think the next thing is the flow control. If-else statements, loops, and their types. So this is also one of the most important concepts, and when you are already accustomed to the fundamentals, you need to understand what you can actually do with this stuff, because this all is pretty static, right? Like you can declare variables and it'll be all fine and dandy, but still you need to somehow progress, you need to somehow move. And in order to move, you need some kind of a flow control. So you need to know how to like branch out, how to do something if something happens, if something else happens, if something even different happens. You need to know the loops, because the loops are basically a way of performing something a couple of times. That's the whole mystery under the loops terminology. So you need to know the loops and the types, like the for loop and the while loop, basically, and the difference between the two. You are going to come across both of these things, these topics, all the time in test automation, also not only in programming itself, because if else, it's the nature of coding and it's the nature of testing also, right? If else, basically, I would just say, you as a tester, me as a tester, we all of us, the whole QA community, we're all basically just big if-else machines, if you think about that. Also, I would say you can extrapolate that to humans also, but that's for another day, for the philosopher's corner on Testeroni. But basically, that's what we do, right? If something is working, then we say it's okay. If it is not, then we raise a bug and we tell the team. So this is why you need if-else statements, because this is the steps in your test cases that are going to be performed by your script. If something happens, it is going to let you know. If something breaks, it'll be red. If it doesn't break, it'll be green, and stuff like that. Of course, also like going through the page, it needs to be your script needs to be ready for different scenarios that might happen on the page. So it also needs if-else for that. And similarly, loops are basically a way of performing something more times than once, which comes down to like the try principle, the repeat yourself, and you are going to see the gravity of learning not to do too much repetition in your code soon enough. But even in test automation, it's no different. Like loops and their types, you need them, because if you do something more than once in your script, very often you don't really need to explicitly put that in code. Like if you just go through a form, for example, and you just need to go through a couple of elements of that form which are pretty identical, like the only thing that changes is the locator or stuff like that, then you can marry the concept of the collection and the loop, for example, because you hold all your locators in the collection and you use a loop to loop through that collection, so to go through each one of the elements of that collection and do something with it, like check it in one way or the other. So flow control is absolutely essential. And after that, we get to the basics of functions, what they are, how to pass an argument and return something. So this is also a big one. Basically, most of the things that you are going to interact within your test automation framework of choice are going to be some kind of a function. So most of the things that you interact with are going to be some kind of wrappers, some kind of high-level keywords. For example, is something you call them in robot framework, that behave like functions. So they are basically what we can think of as a function is some kind of a special word which, when invoked, takes some things in, and we call these things arguments, and out goes something else, which is a return value. And of course, you may have different types of functions. You may have functions which don't take anything in. You may have functions that don't return anything. You may have functions that do neither, and just they perform some action when they are actually run. So this is very important, because when you use your test automation tool, of course you're going to be using a lot of functions, because like I said, every keyword is going to be a function. All the types, all the actions on the page, like the actual verbs you are going to use, are going to be functions. And that's what you should, I think of as a synonymous with the action or with the verb. It's the function. It's when you use a function, you tell your programming language, your tool, your compiler, or whatever, however you want to frame it, you tell the machine to actually perform something, to do something, because it will do what is contained within the body of that function. So it is also absolutely essential. And for example, to get back into the example of what we were talking before, like we were talking about the collections and loops a moment before, that you can have a collection of all the locators and then loop through them to do something. So this something in this scenario is a function. So you can see how it all ties together when you create an actual test script, when you create a test case in code. You are basically using all these things that we're discussing here. You in this example that we just talked about, you have the collection, you loop through it, and you do some stuff inside, and this stuff is very often going to be functions. And if it's not functions, it's something that can be abstracted into a function. So it is just, of course, what I'm saying here, it doesn't have to make any specific sense. Don't try to like rewatch every sentence I'm saying 10 times just to understand. You will get it when you start learning to program. It'll become second nature in no time. But here I'm just trying to give you a bird's eye view on that, to just skim through the topics in order to show you how they intertwine. But you shouldn't stress trying to actually get it the first time, because it's not the goal. We are just talking about the topics you need to learn, and as you learn them, all that I'm talking about here is going to make sense, I promise you. So once again, functions are your verbs, and you absolutely need them to just have some kind of an interaction with the things that are happening within your test case. Even when you are creating, like, for example, a ticket. If you think of a typical ticket in Jira, for example, basically the steps to reproduce are nothing but functions. Like when you have steps to reproduce, like log into that environment, do this, click here, and then the expected result is this, but the actual result is that. That's all we are talking about here. Like the steps you are doing are the functions. Then you have some steps outlined, which are also, all of them are functions. And then after you are done with that, and if you needed to do something a couple of times, it was a loop. And then when you are done, the expected result and versus the actual result is nothing else than an if-else statement. So if this happens, it's synonymous with the expected result, so it passed. But if it doesn't, then it's an else. So sorry, it's rejected because it did not pass. So that's all that's happening. And the last thing, which is, I would say, a little optional, but if you are feeling adventurous, so optionally, very basics, objects and classes. Stuff like what even is the difference between them, what do they consist of, how to instantiate one. So like I'm saying, this is more of an optional learning. I wouldn't certainly say that you need to be any kind of a OOP, so object-oriented programming master. You may need the bare bone minimum of what an object and what a class is, how to instantiate one, what's the difference, what can a class consist of, what are the fields and the methods. But like this is, I would say, optional. That's why I said if you're feeling adventurous, it may come in handy even in the beginning, if depending on the libraries and the automation tools that you are using. But sadly, we wouldn't say that it's like very essential. It may come in handy if you are like using other libraries, for example, and you are trying to import something to understand that you are instantiating an object, for example, from some library and stuff like that, or if you are using some custom objects that are already within the code base of your organization. But I wouldn't say it's absolutely essential, but I think the bare minimum of the topic of the of objects and classes will come to you quickly enough that there's no harm in just getting your feet wet, so that you don't have your head spinning if it's mentioned, and then you can just go further, deeper into that as time goes on. But you have that very, very basic foundation. And so I would say this is it. This is the essential knowledge that you need to know. And you may think, yeah, okay, so let's go on. There's nothing more to go on. This is the essential knowledge you need. And when you know that, you are absolutely ready to take your sword and go for an adventure. You're absolutely ready to jump into the learning process of a test automation tool. And which test automation tool to choose, and if that matters and stuff like that, we already talked about that in the beginning in the which programming language do I choose video. I think there may also be another video on more diving deeper into the topic of test automation tools. But the short answer is you are ready. You can just take your pick and go learn that, because you already have the whole essential knowledge of programming that you need to know. And you may think, yeah, okay, well, but this guy said I need to know that, and this guy, yeah, that's the whole problem. That's what I said. That's what I told you before we did the list. I feel like the resources online focus too much on trying to make you a jack of all trades and learning programming as if it was the end goal, while in actuality, it is the tool allowing you to progress and to find other endeavors that just use this programming. So if you want to be a test automation engineer, this is absolutely enough to get your feet wet into test automation and to progress, of course, your programming knowledge in your free time, but that is enough to actually start learning. And so many of the popular things which are often listed, which I think you don't need. So this list could go on forever, but to just give you a couple of examples, things like working with files, for example, things like more advanced OOP, things like deeper programming concepts, like for example, recursion and language-specific hacks. And like I said, this list could go on and on and on and on, but these are just things that come to your mind the first moment you think about things that people say you need, but you actually don't. Like working with files, of course, it may be needed for a project. It may be needed that you need to handle some kind of a JSON file, some YAML file, that you need to work with some CSV file to import it and stuff like that. But it is not black magic. You will be ready to learn that in one afternoon when you master the fundamentals that we talked about a moment before. And there's no real need to do a whole chapter of a book on working with files when you may not encounter it for a long time when you start doing a project, or you may never encounter it. Of course, it's a useful knowledge. Of course, it's good to know how to open a file, write to a file, and close it. Of course, similar to, I don't know, networking and stuff like that. It is something that is interesting if you like programming. It is something that is useful if your project entails that. But there's 1,000 things that may happen in your project that you may need, and you can't really future-proof yourself by trying to learn everything, because you should learn on the job. You should learn as you go on. If you have the fundamentals, you have nothing to feel about, and there's enough resources that a lifetime won't be enough to learn all of it. So you should just focus on the minimum viable product, the minimum viable amount of knowledge. And so you don't need to work with files just to be able to start learning a test automation tool. Learn it in your free time if you feel like it. If you don't, you will learn it on the job when you actually need it, because many people mistake incompetence with not knowing everything. You are not supposed to know everything. You are supposed to be able to look for everything and to have enough enough of a comfortable grip on the fundamentals that if you suddenly need something else, you are able to quickly retrieve the appropriate resources, learn it, and apply it. You shouldn't be able to constantly try and cram more knowledge into your head, because programming is not your end goal. It is a tool. So you should treat it as a tool, and you should be able to add new things to your toolbox once you master the basic ones. But that's it. Don't try to go overboard with that. Similarly to more advanced OOP concepts, I see many people try and teach the aspiring test automation engineers more advanced concepts like the paradigms of OOP, like some advanced inheritance and stuff like that. To be honest, I think you can be a pretty damn good test automation engineer and not know a single thing about those things. You may not even know how inheritance works, to be honest, because many people fixate on, everything is now object-oriented, or has been for some time, so it's not like I'm sharing a new shiny toy with you here, but still, everything is object-oriented, so I should be able to learn it, and since the languages are all object-oriented, everything is an object, and it's like this generation programming language or next generation programming language, you should try and teach everyone the right way, the object-oriented way. I think it is good if you are interested in that. It is good if you want to be a developer, because then you can't really get around knowing what inheritance is. But if you are going to be a test automation engineer, there's absolutely zero reason to start with learning that rather than going and learning a test automation tool. To be honest, I know this is also a hot take and this may be controversial, but even if your language is great object-oriented, and it greatly features all this stuff under the hood, and it supports everything in multiple inheritors, and oh my god, all these bells and whistles. The fact that it features this doesn't mean that you need to know the first thing about that. Deeper programming concepts, I mentioned recursion, but you can have whatever here, algorithms, you can have generators, understanding, I don't know, map, reduce, what have you. There's thousands of things that you may need to learn if you want to become like I said, 10x developer. But these concepts are really redundant if you are trying to be a test automation engineer. You will learn them along the way, mostly. Many of them you won't. Recursion is pretty big topic if you want to have anything in common with programming itself. But in writing test cases in a test automation tool, honestly, I would say your time is well better spent learning a version control system or learning the basics of your continuous integration and continuous development tools, rather than trying to master recursion and then learning algorithms and doing competitive programming. To be honest, I don't think that's the way if you want to be a test automation engineer. You should value your time, and valuing your time is learning the appropriate stuff and to the extent that is actually needed, and not trying to ace everything, because A, you are going to waste time with that and may never use it, and B, you should remember that you need to be very well versed at different things rather than being an absolute killer at programming while abandoning learning the tools of the trade. And the same goes for language-specific hacks. This goes for conventions, stuff like that. Don't try to study the pep guide for Python and trying to recite passages of the manifesto from your head. That's not really the way. Of course, there are some language-specific hacks. There's some language-specific syntax tools and things that are important. But once again, if it makes your work easier, sure, go for it. If you're interested in that, sure, go for it. But don't procrastinate starting to learn the tool of automation just because you need to learn one more hack that makes these 3 lines 1 line, just because Python that has this very cool tool that may or this very cool functionality that may help you with that. Just stick with the 3 lines and go learn some robot framework. That's my recommendation. And once again, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discourage you from learning this. I think there's actually great utility in learning this, because why not know it? It can only benefit you. So I'm not trying don't learn this. I'm not trying this won't help you. I'm not trying you won't ever use it and you should never ever learn it. I'm just trying to give you the formula for learning as little as possible while also being the most competent. So we are trying to min-max our way into the field of test automation is what we're trying to do. So basically, I feel like when you're learning programming in order to get into test automation, you get to a tipping point, you get to a point of diminishing returns. And after you get there, the progress stops being so fast and growing so fast, and you actually, by investing the same time that you used to, you are getting way less out of it. And we are talking test automation wise. So I heartily really recommend you to learn everything you need to know. Heartily recommend you to do hobby projects. I heartily recommend you to do a lot of programming, but only to the point that it does not hinder your performance and learning in automation itself. So you will learn all of this with experience, with time, with projects that come your way, with organizations that come your way. You will be jumping across languages, you will be jumping across tools, but you should not use it as an excuse to procrastinate learning to test. Because at the end of the day, what matters is knowing enough in all of these fields and knowing as much as possible about the quality assurance process. This is your goal as the test automation engineer, and you shouldn't try to delude yourself into thinking that by learning just one more thing in programming, you are going to be that much more prepared for your job. To be honest, you won't. If you have the fundamentals, everything that branches out from there, the whole magical world of programming, yes, it is interesting, but it is not essential for you to progress, and you should try to progress if you want to get into the field as soon as possible. And with that, I think we're ready to actually do a summary of today's lesson. So, first of all, don't overthink the process. This is something I'm stressing in basically all the videos that are more like broadly knowledge focused. Don't try to overthink the process. It is I understand that overthinking this stuff is a very handy shelter. So it actually helps you to prevent having to learn too much or having to learn anything sometimes. But don't overthink the process. Like, if it feels good, it is good. Try to progress and just go with the flow and learning all the stuff that you need. So your programming knowledge to be used as a tool for learning your automation, learning your framework, and at the same time learning about the processes and all the things that are around that. Would also I think we're going to have a video on the things that are very important but are not really per se programming or testing by itself, by which I mean the testing tools, so the other stuff, but it's for another day. So don't overthink the process. Don't overthink what you need to learn and stuff like that. Like I showed you, if you learn what we've talked about in this lesson, you are absolutely ready to go on merrily on your adventure. So this brings us to the second point: learn the fundamentals and start learning the test automation tool. So this is pretty self-explanatory, and we've already underlined that quite a bit of times during that video, that you should learn the fundamentals, you should learn the most important stuff, you should learn the things that we've talked about, and after you do that, you are absolutely ready to start learning the test automation tool. So you are ready to start learning your framework. You can just pick one and go for it and actually see how you can use the knowledge of programming to tackle a kind of a different but also kind of a similar beast that a testing framework is. So after you learn the fundamentals, don't stay there. If you want to, continue learning, but try to cut some slice of that time pie and use it for actually learning the tools of the trade. And lastly, keep learning. Keep learning along the way, as it will eventually pay off. Yeah, so I tried to underline that payoff because, once again, the goal of this video is not to discourage you from learning to code. I think it's a fascinating adventure, and I think it also is a good way to take your mind off of your job while doing something cool and learning stuff that may one day be valuable to you. But you should keep it like as a side thing to the whole test automation world. So you should, and you will keep learning along the way if you structure your time properly, and it will eventually pay off, because of course all these things, even those that I mentioned as not really being worthwhile in the beginning, they are all very important. They are all very interesting. And like I said in the beginning, you don't need to be a good programmer to be a good test automation engineer, but you certainly need to be a good programmer to be a great test automation engineer. But in the beginning, you should not be preoccupied with the notion of becoming a great test automation engineer. Right now, you are just trying to get into the field, to break into the field, to go from a QA engineer to a test automation engineer, to take the leap and hopefully land on solid ground on the other side. So you should focus on that rather than trying to be the greatest automation engineer in the beginning and trying to be a great programmer first and then a great tester and great this and great that. This is not the way. The way is to learn the absolute minimal in order to be comfortable enough to be able to look for the rest of the knowledge along the way, and to keep learning and keep growing and keep seeing stuff as you experience it, because many of the things you're going to encounter over the course of your career are things that you would never, ever see in a book, in a video tutorial, or in your nightmares, to be honest. So, yeah, it's an adventure. It's an adventure, and you should partake in it by learning the bare minimum of programming that you need in order to be able to progress to the actual tool that you're going to use on the day-to-day basis at your job, which is the framework. And so with that, thank you very much for this lesson. I hope that some weight has been removed from your shoulders by showing you that actually the knowledge that you need is not that high. The time it takes to actually master it is not going to make you a secluded caveman on an island somewhere on the ocean, having to learn programming for 10 winters and 10 summers before you can progress to test automation. You don't need to do that. You can actually do that way faster, and I think with a better payoff at the end, because you are not learning the fundamentals, just the fundamentals, because you're lazy. You're learning them because you need to jump a bunch of wagons before you can actually be competent in as much of the fields and as much of the topics as you need to be in order to be a good and competent test automation engineer. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope to see you in the next video. I really recommend going back to the previous ones and watching them also, to follow us on Instagram or on Facebook. And if you have any questions, doubts, comments, just feel free to leave them in the comments here. Thank you very much for your attention, and keep on rocking.